Merge online kickoff conference. We're super happy to see all of you here today. I'm Jenni Kilpi from Demos Helsinki. We are a part of the Merge consortium. I'm here with colleagues Lee and Olli. Then the rest of, or many of the Merge people will then later get a chance to introduce themselves and speak a bit more. Maybe, Alisa, you can go to the next slide. So just a couple of housekeeping notes, as we, at least in signups, are a few hundred. So good to have some ground rules. Please keep your mic on mute. And then we would love to hear who are here. So if you feel comfortable, please put your name here also in Zoom and your organization. Then we are very happy to hear your questions and comments. Please, throughout the session, leave them in the comments box, and then later we also will have more time for discussions. And Lee is here for support if you experience any difficulties or drop out of the session. So please send her an email. And I believe we will have people dropping in throughout the session. So let's remember hosts to keep getting them in as we speak. Okay, well, then let's move forward to some opening words from our end at the Merge project and for us at Demo. So why are we here today? We titled this event Economy that would improve well-being for all now and in the future. But reading the news these days, it doesn't seem like well-being is our top priority. It's understandable to be easily overwhelmed by the stream of geopolitical tensions, economic challenges, damage to the environment. And while it might seem natural to settle for just then getting by, that simply is not acceptable. And we are indeed capable of acting together, coordinating actions and interventions, producing knowledge and converging around what matters and what should be prioritized. And this is what brings us to right now. So we have here a great diverse group of experts who've dedicated their time to advancing sustainable inclusive well-being, and now they're doing that together in the Merge project. And as a coordination and support action project funded by Horizon Europe, we've spent the past year building the case for convergence and coordination. And this year we're hosting a variety of events to see what sticks, which processes should be intervened, which wordings to be used, and basically what needs to happen when and by whom to develop policies, metrics, and models for sustainable inclusive well-being. And this Merge Kickoff Conference is our invitation for you to share your insights and feedback. We are very happy that you're all here. Then if we move still forward to the agenda is quite simple. We will first hear lightning speeches from the researchers to bring for you a narrative of where we are thus far in the project, or where we've landed. And then we've asked a few commentators to share what they think, and finally, and most importantly, hear from you. Great. Thank you. And I give it over now to our consortium lead, Tuuli Hirvilammi from Tampere University. Take it away, Tuuli.
Thank you, Jenni. Thank you for the kind words and very nice, inspiring introduction, and welcome everyone on my behalf as well to this conference. I had also planned to tell something on Merge to start. So Alisa, you can go to the next slide, please. But as Jenni mentioned, we are not a research project as such, but we can go to the next slide already. We bring together different research projects. So our purpose is not to work in silos. We try to come together and, as said, join our forces towards a shared goal. We work closely with policy advocacy partners, so this makes it different. This is why it's called Coordination and Support Action Project, funded by European Horizon. We work with policy advocacy partners, as you see, Demos Helsinki, so a European Policy Center, social platform, for example, Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Research and Degrowth, International Research and Degrowth are involved. Then we have a different offices for national statistics involved. We also work closely with European Commission through Joint Research Center, and then we have research partners involved. And we really are super inspired by this momentum that has been now given to us to join forces and to work towards synergies and convergence. And what helps us to work together is our common understanding of sustainable and inclusive well-being. In the next slide, you see that my illustration of ongoing different discourses. So we know we are now getting more and more familiar with all different concepts like the donut economics, well-being economics, post-growth, degrowth, beyond GDP, beyond growth, whatever you can name it. But actually, what unites all these is, of course, the kind of understanding that we have to ensure well-being within planetary boundaries. We also have to take into consideration that social justice, so the well-being has to be sustainable and inclusive. So this is considered as a new overarching policy goal for policies, metrics, and models at the different level. So inspired by this systems thinking, we consider sustainable and inclusive well-being as a goal. And what we need to do now is to revise policies, metrics, and models. So no more disagreement. What is the goal? We know it, it's widely shared, but now it's just kind of hands-on work. What policies, metrics, and models could serve this purpose? And in the next slide, I have provided the kind of analytical, very brief definition of how we consider sustainable and inclusive well-being. It's about current well-being, future well-being, but also about multidimensional equity. So this inclusion aspect, we have to limit inequalities across social groups, but also within and between countries. And as said, the different dimensions are analytical purposes, because then they can help to inform what kind of metrics should be chosen and what policy outcomes we should be looking for. And if you are interested in reading more how we suggest this, how we consider this change the goal task to revise the European policy making, I suggest to have a look at this policy advocacy paper we published last summer called A European Agenda to Navigate Uncertain Times. And there we actually already elaborate on quite concrete policy proposals, because as I mentioned, we also have to revise the policies and policy making. And next slide, please. There are already ongoing suggestions. So maybe one key takeaway from this is, as well, is that we are not lacking alternatives. We also have policy suggestions, different reviews, meta-synthesis done. For example, this policy database called Sustainable Prosperity already includes more than 200 different policy instruments or measures that could be implemented if there was a political will to do that. We in Merge, we work together with policymakers at the EU level, national level, and international level. We organize workshops in certain countries, for example, to bring together people who are working with well-being economy and different kind of just transition processes. At the EU level, we've started to and chosen to work at the different policy topics. And we also try to keep an eye on what happens at the UN level, for example, what will happen after Agenda 2030. So this is what we do with policies, and it's also super important, of course, to work together with policymakers. And next slide, I think I will finish here just to once more highlight and emphasize that this our framework is very widely shared, and it's coming a new common ground for beyond GDP metrics, policies, and models. And it's not that important what concept is used, but there are not so distinct camps or clubs, but we all work towards this. And for example, also at the EU level, there is an inter-service working group working on sustainable and inclusive well-being topic. And the survey we conducted last summer also shows that at least the policymakers and stakeholders who responded are quite familiar with this concept already. So maybe this is a promising momentum. But I leave it here and I hand over to Rutger to talk more about the metrics.
Yes, thanks, Tuli. Yeah, a crucial part of the debate is, of course, how to measure sustainable inclusive well-being. Next slide, please. And one of the things that I think we all realize, or at least people that are familiar with this topic, is that this is not just a recent discussion. I would say that really for 50 years we've had this discussion. There were a couple of efforts to go beyond GDP, as it's called, after the war, but really from the 1970s and especially the late 80s, this has really started to balloon. But of course, this also meant that the heterogeneity in our community, so to speak, has expanded over time. Next slide, please. So that's why in the Merge Consortium, we decided also to write a report specifically to see whether there was a certain degree of convergence. And so we looked at that issue from the conceptual level. Is there certain concepts that we're converging towards? Also at the thematic level. So when we are talking, for example, well-being, are we talking about the same determinants for well-being, for example? And then at the third layer, at the indicator and index level. And what we did was actually take 90 of the most famous indexes or dashboards really to focus our analysis on. Next slide, please. Now, this is probably not legible for you, but just to show you a little bit of the typology that we use. So we really structured for all these 90 dashboards and indicators, we scored them on many different typologies, and you're really welcome to look at the report for details. But I'd just like to focus on the conclusions about the convergence. So first, next slide, please, Yanni. So first, on the issue of the conceptual convergence, as Tuli said, although for 50 years we've had many different types of things, if at its core you look at all of these approaches, they seem to be focusing on well-being, which sometimes is called quality of life or welfare. So there's certain accurate or synonyms, of course, but so there's the well-being aspect that's being focused on. There's the inequality aspect that's focused on, which is represented by this inclusion word. And then there's the future aspects of sustainability and future well-being, which is taken on board. And in reality, a lot of different words are used for these things, but at its core, these are the concepts that are being discussed. Now, a lot of this convergence, I think, could be broken down to the Brundtland's report, of course, where we had the definition of sustainable development, but also was heavily influenced by the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report in 2009. And already there is quite a bit of convergence at the institutional level. Here we've named quite a few prominent UN, OECD, but notably also the European Commission processes where this convergence towards sustainable inclusive well-being is happening. And even at the country level, this Brundtland-Stiglitz framing has been adopted for a while. Next slide, please. Now, on the thematic and indicator convergence, there is a certain degree of convergence, which are also related to two separate measurement systems, one by the UNECE and one by the OECD Better Life Initiative, where there's already a certain degree of convergence around 20 themes that are being used at this moment. We did also look at different ways of looking at this, because this is very much the institutionalization of themes. We also looked at machine learning type methodologies in the report, also coming up with ways perhaps to make this smaller, but at the institutional level, there does also seem to be a certain degree of institutionalization of themes. And then finally, in the report, we also looked at, next slide, please, Jenny. We also looked at indicator convergence. So out of the 90, we know that some are really popular, some are really used for many years or for many countries. And so we also analyzed basically the use and popularity of these various indicators in the report. So finally, I think just from the metrics perspective, in the next slide, we have three main conclusions. We feel, I think all of us feel, that it's really important to have this type of convergence. Firstly, it really helps to communicate the stories that we have to a wider audience, but it also helps us to coordinate within our post-growth community. Then it also is quite important to stimulate this institutionalization. And from that perspective, I think it's a very healthy sign that the European Commission, OECD, UN, and a couple of governments are also converging towards a similar methodological framing. And then finally, one of the things about GDP is really also that there's a link to a broader system of accounting. So the GDP is linked to the system of national accounts. And we also feel that in this process towards modeling, it's also important to actually link the metrics for sustainable inclusive well-being to a broader accounting system. And from that accounting system, a modeling will also emerge. And that is also the topic of the next speaker, Rob, that I'd like to hand over now. Oh, sorry, was it not Rob? Sorry.
Sorry, Rutger, we changed it so that Brent is speaking next, but
Okay.
we'll
Yeah,
indeed
sure.
speak further along in the event. Go ahead, Brent.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Rutger. Building on what Rutger was just saying, in Merge, it's a CSA project, but it's also we have fresh research to also present. And the next couple of slides, we'll talk about a new piece of research that we did in Merge. So on the next slide, what we did an online survey. We polled 6 different countries to see what the public appetite for these sustainable and inclusive well-being indicators is. Because we argue that the more they resonate with EU citizens, the easier they will be to adopt for both policymakers and politicians. So we did a survey on the public appetite for these SIW indicators. We polled 6 different countries: Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, and Finland. We had a representative sample of 1,000 respondents in each of the countries, and we collected the data late last year. On the next slide, you see 3 of the main scopes that we had in the survey. So first, we wanted to see to what extent EU citizens support this use of beyond GDP indicators to measure progress and to use as policy objectives. Secondly, we're exploring what kind of communication strategies can increase this public support for the adoption of beyond GDP metrics. And third, we're looking at some of the concepts and themes or domains that appeal most to EU citizens through the survey that we organized. On the next slide, we have the results. I think it's an additional click for the first part. What's the general support for beyond GDP indicators? This is one of the 4 indicators that we've used in the sample. So we ask respondents, the government should measure how well my country is doing by, and then combinations of beyond GDP indicators to GDP. And we see on average that 81% of EU citizens supports the use of beyond GDP metrics to measure how well his or her country is doing. In different degrees, the different shades of green indicate different weights given to beyond GDP measures. But on average, 81% of the respondents agree to use beyond GDP measures, whereas 7% of the respondents would say GDP only is what we need to measure when seeing what progress my country is making. And there's 12% of the people saying don't know. On the next slide, there's the results for the 3 other indicators, but very high level, equal high support. 72% of respondents agreed strongly or tended to agree with the statement on whether on that the economy should prioritize health and well-being of people and nature over focusing solely on profit and increasing incomes in one's country. So again, support of 3/4 of the respondents. Similar for signing a petition that would be shared with the head of government of the different countries in which we did the survey. And 82% of the respondents agreed to give part of a special prize they could win when doing our survey to an NGO working on beyond GDP, with an average donation of this €100 prize of 24 euros. And so in general, there's quite high support for using beyond GDP measures across the 6 countries that we've polled. On the next slide, you'll see the second scope of the survey. We try to see whether certain kind of informational treatments could increase this level of support for beyond GDP, but given that the initial levels were already quite high, it was not that easy. We've had different informational treatments in a survey experiment that looked at different deficiencies of GDP when used as a welfare measure. So we have a control group, and then they were just explained what GDP is, and then 4 other groups had the same explanation about GDP, but also some of the deficiencies of GDP, not looking at quality of life, not looking at distributional aspects, not including sustainability issues, and then a combinations of all the 3 previous treatments. And we found that in the whole sample, there was only one treatment that increased the support for beyond GDP measure, and that's focusing on inclusion. So the second treatment, that was the one that overall samples was increasing beyond GDP support. But again, it was already quite high at the beginning, so we didn't expect to find that big differences in the first place either, or at least not after the first surveys that we did. It will also allow us to see how different subgroups reacted differently to these treatments. And for instance, if we would focus only on respondents with an above average income level, we see that inclusion doesn't play for them when it comes to increasing support for beyond GDP measures, but focusing on quality of life did. And so the data allow for a much richer analysis than what we're presenting here on this slide. On the next slide, we have the last scope, which kind of indicator concepts are preferred. On the left, you see Rutger's triangle that he just explained, but on top, well-being, bottom right, sustainability, bottom left, inclusion. We asked respondents to see what kind of indicators they would want to have in a progress measuring data set for the country, and 60% was in the middle, so including all 3 concepts was very important to EU respondents. And so at the core, if we developed a data set on measuring progress in countries, it should at least include well-being, sustainability, and inclusion in there. On the next slide, we also polled different themes or domains. We asked respondents to rank different domains related to well-being, and across all 6 countries, we also have, of course, results per country individually, but across all 6, the common ones were also mentioned, like health, safety, jobs and education, housing and income, and also planetary health had above 15% of people taking it up into their top 3 of most important domains. So on the last slide, just a couple of conclusions. So there's high level of support for these sustainable and inclusive well-being indicators. Recommendation, we should listen to the EU citizens and align indicators with their priorities. We should also increase education and communication about beyond GDP indicators and the problems that GDP is having when being used as a welfare measure. And lastly, we can also try and develop tailored communication strategies for diverse audiences, emphasizing inclusion. For many groups that would work, but for others, it would seem better to focus on strategies and communication in terms of quality of life. And as the results of a fresh piece of research that we've managed to get out of Merge, I'll now pass it on to Rob to talk about how these indicators can be included in models for the economy.
Thanks, Rent. So I don't think it's news for anybody here, but we're currently not meeting all our social goals, or like, let's say, achieving well-being for the whole population on Earth, while at the same time overshooting planetary boundaries. So currently our socioeconomic systems are not geared towards achieving this sustainable and inclusive well-being. They're more focused on achieving growth, achieving profits for a privileged class of people, while a large fraction of the world population is still not being able to meet their basic needs. And part of the problem is that our economic systems are focused on achieving this growth. So if we want to be able to achieve sustainable and inclusive well-being, we need to think about how to reform or how to restructure our socioeconomic systems to achieve this goal. And one tool that you can use to think about how to transform these systems is macroeconomic modeling, because it provides us a high-level overview of how an economy works, and it allows us to assess the systemic effects of specific policies, specific transition scenarios, and so on. Next slide. The problem is that for a lot of existing, let's say, traditional macroeconomic modeling frameworks, they're focused very much on the economic side. So this is what you see on the left-hand side. So they focus on economic flows, monetary flows, but they don't represent that well society or economy or the Earth systems. And so to be able to model sustainable, inclusive well-being, we need to move towards a more whole systems approach to modeling. And so the picture on the right-hand side, it's one of the foundational pictures for ecological economics, where we see that the economy is embedded within a broader society, which is in turn embedded within Earth systems. And so a good functioning of all these systems is required to achieve sustainable and inclusive well-being. So one piece of research that we did last year is to look at existing ecological macroeconomic models, so models that try to include some of these dimensions that go beyond the typical macroeconomics. And what we found is that on the environmental side, usually the indicators that are included are related to climate change and energy use, because they are typically on the top of the priority lists for policies. And then also land conversion is quite well covered. But other environmental indicators that are essential to the functioning of our Earth systems, such as nitrogen and phosphorus loading, biodiversity loss, soil quality, are barely included in existing models. Then on the social side, we see that there's a strong focus on more the economic measures, such as employment, income, economic development, but intangible indicators such as life satisfaction, justice, or social support are barely included. And also indicators related to the achievement of basic needs, such as mobility, housing, education, are not that often included. So there is still a big gap in moving towards this whole systems modeling approach. So you can see in the next slide some of the things that we think are important to include in modeling frameworks to move towards this goal. First of all, on the biophysical side, models should express their dependence on ecosystems through the inclusion of material and energy flows as inputs into the economy. And also they should show in some way how human societies are affecting ecosystems. So how human activity has an effect and is changing ecosystems. On the socioeconomic side, there should be a representation of inequality. So what kind of households or different types of social groups do exist, and how do they have different access to essential goods and services, or how is their income different, for instance. And then also we need to be cautious about decoupling. So how easily can a society reduce its environmental pressures while maintaining a certain level of economic output? Traditional models are relatively optimistic on this. So we need to be cautious about this, because if you're assuming that we have very high decoupling rates, it seems like we can keep on growing without threatening our sustainability goals, which is a point of contention in the literature. Then on the social side, there should be an inclusion of basic human needs. And also it should be included how easily people can afford essential goods that help them satisfy these needs. And then in the last slide, I just want to give you a quick overview of some existing models that are already working towards this, that include some of these dimensions. And then on the right-hand side, you see some of the existing research projects that are developing new models that go beyond this. And with this, I'll leave the floor to Bob Costanza, who will take it.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And I think you made the point, and several of the previous talks have made the point that what we need now is more of a whole systems approach. And I think we need an approach that also can handle the dynamics of the system. So next slide. And also we need to consider how to make the transition from where we are now to the new system that we're talking about. And I think part of the problem is that we need this whole integrated system, the connection between the metrics, the models, the policies, to support the new social goals that we're talking about. One of the reasons I think that GDP has been so recalcitrant is that it does have the system of national accounts. It has a whole series of policies and interest groups that are supported by that. And so the whole regime, the combination of policies, metrics, and models all together support continuing toward the GDP growth goal. So how do we change that? Well, I think we do need this more integrated system. We need to recognize the importance of linking together the metrics, the models, and the policies. And as Rob was just saying, we don't have models that do that right now, and I think they need to be connected much more closely with the kinds of metrics that we're coming up with. And I think that's what one of the goals of the ongoing Merge project is to make sure that connection happens, and also to look at how to evaluate the mix of policies using the new models and the new metrics. I think that's going to be very important to make our case and to show what kinds of policies would really best lead us toward the goal of sustainable and inclusive well-being. So doing all of those things together is really what's missing, or what's been missing, I think, and is part of the strategy for making this transition. I think that's kind of part of our theory of change, is that first of all, we need to show how this new system could work and how it could improve people's lives. And getting that message out not only to the policymakers, but I think also to the general public, that it's one thing to say, yes, GDP doesn't cover everything we want to measure, but it's also something that it's also needed to say, well, how is that changing that going to improve people's lives? And I think, in fact, part of the reason that we've seen this political shift, towards right-wing populism, is that this focus on GDP has not really ended up in improving many people's lives. They've seen a lot of that improvement in GDP going to a small fraction of the population. They haven't seen their own lives improving. We're not measuring their well-being. We're not measuring the impacts of that current strategy on increasing inequality, et cetera. So I think it's incumbent on us, if we want to reverse that trend and really make this transition to a sustainable and inclusive future, to integrate these three elements. And down on the bottom, there's a link and a citation to a report that we did. I think all of the speakers that have gone so far on that report, where we tried to pull together all of the things that have been mentioned previously, and try to lay out the path for the future of the Merge project. How do we actually build this integrated system? How do we get models that really do include the dynamics, not just are more comprehensive, but can actually get at the dynamics of the system, so we can make projections into the future and see which policies are more sustainable, and that include society and the environment in those things, and connect directly to the kinds of metrics that we've built consensus on. We're doing additional work on how to build that consensus on the metrics, but I think connecting that with the models and the policies is going to be essential to do that. So, yeah, and who goes next?
Thank you, Bob. It's Mario.
Mario, sorry.
Go ahead, Mario. Are we hearing your voice?
So thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Jenny. Very happy to be here and to close this webinar, let's say, and open to the debate. So reaping the benefit of convergence through new consensus, please go on, is a very important issue. It came really in all the speech you were listening so far. It's so important to find this consensus, since it is where we really can make the difference. This is a very important, let's say, element in the beyond GDP debate. Well, we feel there are many things, and the three most important things is to talk about concept, model, measurement, and policies. But these need to be integrated, and we need to share and find a new consensus. Indeed, as Rutger was saying, it's 50 years. There are already some alternative, let's say, way of measuring. The point is, this shared vision needs to be fostered through an overarching goal of sustainable and inclusive development through finding new consensus. But this new consensus is somehow rooted in our capacity to find a theoretical consensus, a technical consensus, a policy consensus, and a public consensus. I think this is really central. So far, many springs were born to go beyond GDP. But then they were creating some streams that had to be and enter into what I would call a river. So it is the time now, really, when most of the people, or if not all the people, that were finding new solution for understanding better how to measure and go beyond GDP, was together also from a theoretical consensus point of view. So to think about sustainable and inclusive well-being, to understand better how to measure and how to count about well-being of people and of the planet, well, is really a matter of theoretical consensus. So if we may agree on the vision, also the theoretical consensus is very important. Then there is the technical consensus, which is something we are really trying to do our best. Indeed, if I would say the most important part of our project Merge is really our desire to an aspiration to find also not just theoretical, but also technical consensus. Why we need so having a composite indicator or a common dashboards? It's not just a question of operativity, which is already very important. It's also a question of understanding and helping each other to find the best solutions that we have so far in order to measure and measuring in time our progresses. Then there is this policy consensus. To who we are talking to? We are talking to all different stakeholders, but very important is that policy actors, let's say, are fully embedded in this process and are really interested in creating a policy consensus towards this direction. Then we have public consensus, which is very important. Citizens are active and should be active in the public scrutiny and engagement, and all societal actors, including the civil society actors, should be part of this process. It's not just, let's say, an academic process. It's a process that is much broader, and it has been started since long. But now is the time to converge. So we need, if you can go next, Jenny, the new political economy of sustainable and inclusive well-being. This is quite central, and it takes into account the theoretical framing on which to build principle and directionality for policymaking, but also the institutional change that are required in this process in different areas, and the role of and the linkages among different actors. So improving as well the technical capacities in policymaking and measurement. In other words, theoretical and technical capacities on which we are working deeply, especially linking measurement with policies, as Bob was saying, are necessary but not sufficient condition. There is the need to change the narrative, but at the same time, there is the need to find the political willingness and will to the interaction and of all societal actors. When I say all societal actors, I'm referring to the quintuple helix, so the fact that we are policy, as humans, we are policy makers, we are part of the institution, but we are also researcher, we are business, in part of business, we are part of this society, and we are part of the nature as well. So there is the need for an inner transformation in this big effort. So I have the honor also to conclude in the next slide what we want to bring to you. And we want to bring that while we are discussing, we found ourselves in a difficult position, but at the same time in a very strong position, because things are already happening. People know what is the vision of development, what should be. And there is already the opportunity to find convergence. It's not that we are, let's say, just starting. We are really in a process that we should now try to focus and to find, let's say, the consensus to find really a solution. So also to redesign, let's say, policies and goals according to sustainable and inclusive well-being. We decided to use the term of sustainable and inclusive well-being because it is bringing somehow a new paradigm and is embracing all those springs that I was mentioning you before and streams, well, to be part of this, a very important process of change. So it really is which is going to touch our well-being. Then the convergence is already happening. This is something that we feel and is very important, and we are, as group, part of, and you that are listening, part of this process. So it's not something that is coming out of nothing. It's something that is already there, and we should look, and we should take care about it. We should care about all this process. Then there is an European, and especially the European Commission demand, but also the European Union idea for sustainable and inclusive well-being. And this is quite central, is a very important element that give us really this idea of political will to go in this direction. Then our decision is clearly are based on an adequate view of the world. This has been our starting point. Well, how we measure our progress really is not justified anymore. Is unable to understand and comprehend what is going on, and especially what is the impact on our well-being. So to better models to capture social, ecological, economic impacts are in progress and are part of our research and should be shared and are really important to give an adequate view of the world. Then we should argue about for systems approach. Well, it's not something that is something we are discussing since long. So there is the need about convergence and coordination about goals, policies, indicators, and let's say to understand the current system. And we reap the benefit of convergence through new consensus, which is something I already said, but it's clear that consensus is a verb, and we want to have consensus in theory, technical action, policy, but also with public engagement of people and public scrutiny. So to be able to do what we need to have a new political economy, which is really central if we want to reach this important change that Tuli has mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Jenny, yeah.
Yes, over to me. Thank you, Mario. So this concludes the lightning speeches, and now we are going to move on to the commentary speeches. So we first have Laura de Bonfils, the Secretary General from the Social Platform. Laura, feel free to open your mic and start your comment speech.
So thank you so much for inviting me. First, I want to apologize for my voice. And thank you for all the speeches, because they were very, very interesting, like to see how the Merge project is progressing, but as well to put, like to look at the well-being focus from a different perspective. So we, of course, as Social Platform, fully agree on having like the overarching policy goal of sustainable and inclusive well-being as the well-being of people from the current and future generation and like on a livable planet. It should be the goal. But we see that this is like is aligned as well on the EU aims, so as defined in the treaties. So there is like to promote peace, European values, and the well-being of its people. But actually, even though this is in the treaties, we see that this goal is still not guiding the Commission policies and action, and a lot of you, the speakers, have highlighted. And we've seen in the last mandate some of the progress that was done, because there was actually, we've seen some progress on environmental sustainability with the European Green Deal, and also on a lesser extent more on the social side with the European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan. And these have been some of the right directions towards sustainable and inclusive well-being, but there is still a lot to do. And this goal and the approach is still not there. As many of you have said already, we still we have a population that are still at risk of poverty and exclusion. Like in 2023, there was 21% of the EU population was at risk of poverty, and actually poverty has been growing since the COVID pandemic, but as well with the cost of living crisis in the last years, and we are missing all of the targets that we have set for, like, as the EU to be reached, and we are very far from reaching them. So instead, we're actually seeing, like in the current Commission, a rhetoric, like a switch towards the focus on competitiveness and looking at the prosperity of only the economy and continuing working in silos. So a social platform, but as also others have highlighted, like the switch has to happen and looking at well-being. So then Europe cannot be competitive if its people, that it's the biggest resource, but also the planet, are left behind. And if we don't fight, so as I said, for as well to being in the planetary boundaries, and we don't fight for countering climate change in a socially just way. So we need to, like, really continue advocating, as Mario just said, on this switch on, like going beyond competitiveness, but also putting sustainable well-being at the center of our policies and measurement, but also of our models. And just to focus on what Roger has said, like looking at the beyond GDP metrics. So it's also, thank you for highlighting the importance of the different indicators and also the importance of converging towards a common system. And it's very important to have quality measurements that include both aspects, like the social and environmental aspect, to also identify the complexity of the barriers for improving the well-being of people and planet, and how to develop the right policies to address this. One aspect, though, that wasn't mentioned, for example, is the importance of good disaggregated data. And it's we're seeing that currently that's where we are also struggling with, for example, like if we look at the social side on the social scoreboard for the monitors, the implementation of the social pillar, we don't have a good disaggregation of data there. So and we see a lot of limitation. For example, there is a very low number of indicators that can be used. As was already highlighted, and the focus is a lot on employment, and also like the disaggregation is lacking the disaggregation by type of population, so we can't address the well-being of all people. So just to comment, for example, on the survey that Merge has conducted, it was very good to see the public perception on sustainable and inclusive well-being, and looking at how actually people are asking to go to identify like new objectives and go beyond GDP indicators. And it's also like this shows how people want a different policy making, put people and the planet at the center. This goes in line with several of the Eurobarometer research that we've seen, that where people are asking to look at the working conditions, the living conditions as well, the quality of the services that they access. And that's very important for them. It's also like to look at the different aspects of the well-being or living in the EU. So yeah, just to say, we are facing the current risk, as I said in my opening, that it's the switch towards the narrow focus on competitiveness. And we must ensure strong reforms and investment that strengthen people well-being instead of predominantly focus on efforts on supporting business through competitiveness and industrial policy. So we've seen that the prosperity of industry, of the economy, doesn't necessarily trickles down to tangible well-being for people on the ground if we actually don't address it. So it's very important to do this complete switch towards sustainable, inclusive well-being. And there have been like some, actually this was already, like you talked a lot about the recommendation of Citizen, and they had like very interesting recommendations for building this sustainable and inclusive well-being framework. And it's the Merge project has, for example, together with the sister projects, advocated for an EVP in the Commission for Wellbeing and Future Generation. This didn't happen, but this could have had actually in their mandate the development of such framework. But we as a group and as well as a vast NGOs, but as well a research group, we will continue advocating for mainstreaming well-being across the EU policy making. And just to conclude, even though there is still, like as I said, this growing focus on competitiveness, there are some upcoming opportunities to strengthen sustainable inclusive well-being. As Mario highlighted, we need to work towards having an integrated consensus and focusing on, but just like also like pushing for like looking at the policy consensus. We need, as a like from a social platform perspective, a three-sided approach. So we need to continue advocating for an integrated system, as well as advocate for a strong implementation of the existing initiatives that are currently, for example, in the pillar of social rights, but as well in what is left on the European Green Deal. And we need to prevent them from being rolled back under the new focus. And as well, we need to continue utilizing the EU upcoming initiatives on such as the revision of the action plan of the pillar of social rights, the new anti-poverty strategy that was launched, but as well the competitiveness compass that was launched last week could have a different angle if we continue advocating for sustainable and inclusive well-being, to add a social and human rights dimension, but as well to add like connecting it to the environmental priorities. And finally, we need to advocate for social policy initiatives that are currently not on the European Commission agenda, but that are needed to fill existing gaps of implementing, for example, the pillar, but a broader social Europe, and connecting the different policies, like breaking the silos of policies. Just to conclude, the Merge project plays a crucial role to inform the decision-making with research insight around the importance of sustainable inclusive well-being as a policy objective, and the importance of using to consolidate beyond GDP metrics to measure the things that matter. So we need to continue doing this project like this to try to inform decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. We are very happy to have you here with us. And then finally, before the discussion, I give it over to Dennis Snower, President at the Global Solutions Initiative. And with Dennis's speech, we find a segue towards discussing these all together. So if you already have questions, you can post them on the chat. But now, Dennis, please go ahead. I believe you might still be muted.
Since the time remaining is very short, I will make 4 points and then move to the discussion. Point number 1 is that in order for well-being metrics to be truly influential in the practical world, it is important that they be consistent across countries and through time. And so in the Global Solutions Initiative that advises the G20 and the G7 from year to year, we have metrics for over 160 countries over at least 2 decades. And we look not only at countries, but also at other stakeholders, in particular business. Business is an important stakeholder because GDP currently and shareholder value help run much of economic activity on the policy and on the business front. And so if we want well-being measures to be effective, it needs consistency across the business and country divide. So my first point is that consistency is really important. And it's not only consistency in measurement, but it's also then consistency in reporting, and then in consistency in governance structures that induces the actors to act in accordance with what is being reported on. Otherwise, it's just empty words. And so keeping these things in mind, I think that's sort of point one, consistency. Point two is that it's important to differentiate, to my mind, between 4 different aspects of what you call well-being. One are aggregate overviews of well-being, life satisfaction, happiness, and so on. They provide very little guide for policy. To tell a policymaker that life satisfaction is increased by 1.2% is not informative in terms of what policies. So there are these aggregate measures. They are useful because they tell you something about how the population feels as a whole. It's a bit like you've landed in a plane and you've asked how was the flight, and you say pretty good. It doesn't help the pilot steer the plane, but it tells you something. The second aspect that you need that I think are particularly important are drivers of well-being, which are what are the economic, social, and environmental drivers of well-being. And certainly on the economic front, GDP and its distribution and poverty measures and so on are important drivers. On the social side, 2 really important drivers are solidarity, which concerns how do societies cohere with one another, and agency, which is to what degree are people able to influence their lives through their own efforts. Those are really important drivers on the social front. And then on the environmental front, obviously, sustainability, which probably emanates from a sense of environmental relatedness. So putting these drivers together, we have found particularly useful on the G20 front, on which there now appears to be some consensus around a dashboard of 4 drivers: solidarity, agency, material gain, which is GDP, etc., and environmental sustainability. SAGE, SAGE. It's like a sage approach to life. And we've measured this for the G20 countries, but as I said, for 160 countries beyond that. And there is a consensus building on the G20 front that G20 policy should be evaluated in those. And it would be nice, I think, for the G20 and the European efforts to build bridges towards one another, because obviously Europe doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is a very important part of the global economy. So I've said differentiate between aggregate overviews drivers, and then outcomes of flourishing, of which a lot of the indicators that you have are outcomes of flourishing. And fourth are pathways to flourishing. Education, employment, religious institutions, and so on. Those are also very helpful. So my second point is simply to differentiate between overviews, drivers, outcomes, and pathways of well-being. And that would be, I think, very useful from a policy point. And we've certainly found that that's the case. My third point concerns these drivers of well-being, SAGE, the SAGE dashboard in particular. What I think we should think about carefully is it possible really to aggregate these different aspects into one index of overall well-being? And let me just give you an analogy. A pilot, if I just to continue the airplane analogy, needs to know the height, the altitude of the plane and the speed of the plane. But it would make very little sense to average the speed and altitude. You need both to be absolutely right. You also need the direction to be accurate. And so are these different drivers of well-being really aggregable into one overall index? Or are they really context dependent, or certain minimal levels of solidarity, agency, gain, and environment all essential for well-being? So if you believe in an aggregate index, then you must be able to answer my question that if I were to put you into solitary confinement in a prison, so that you lack agency and you lack solidarity, how much consumption do I need to give you to compensate to make you just as well off as you were before? Well, it sounds like a nonsensical question, but it's getting at what I'm after, that there are certain components of well-being that probably cannot be aggregated and need to remain as a dashboard. So that's my third point, concerns that. And my fourth point concerns your categories of well-being, inclusion, and sustainability. There is a danger, if you use that categorization, of falling into the individualism trap, that well-being is the sum of the well-beings of all individuals, and if you include enough individuals and they all have a minimum of well-being, then you're fine. But as a point of fact, we know from social psychology and many other fields, sociology, anthropology, and so on, that individuals derive their well-being not only in their capacity as individuals, but also as participants in their social and political groups. And therefore, this participation in collective well-being is something that should be taken seriously. And so, if you consider indices like solidarity and agency, you can derive distributions of solidarity and agency just like you can derive distributions of income. There's no problem there. And there's an aspect of inclusion with regard to solidarity and an aspect of inclusion with regard to agency that needs to be considered just as seriously as with material goods and services. And therefore, focusing on inclusion does not capture, I think, the collective aspect of well-being, the importance of societies cohering, and to broaden one's concepts to include that would be really good. So that basically summarizes. I made a point of consistency, differentiating between these four aspects of well-being, looking at different drivers of well-being as on a par, they're not aggregable. And the fourth is this question that we need to consider both individual and collective well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis.